He promised himself he would never save anyone again. After one call went wrong, after one life he couldn't bring back, he chose silence over duty, distance over hope. But on this frozen mountain road, in the middle of a blizzard that erased everything, his dog suddenly stopped and refused to move. And in that moment, he realized something important. Some promises don't protect us. They just keep us from turning back when someone needs us the most. Snow erased the mountain road as the wind howled through the pines, turning the Montana night into a white, restless void where even headlights felt fragile. Ray Coleman had learned to respect storms like this, the kind that didn't announce themselves loudly, but crept in and swallowed everything all the same. At 63, he no longer fought the cold with bravado. He moved with caution, stiffness etched into every step, his breath measured, his thoughts quieter than they used to be. Ray was tall, once powerfully built, now leaner in a way that spoke less of fitness and more of years spent enduring pain rather than avoiding it. His shoulders still carried the squared posture of a man trained to stand his ground, but time had softened the edges. His face was deeply lined, weathered by sun, smoke, and nights that never truly slept. A trimmed gray beard shadowed his jaw, thicker along the chin where he never bothered to shave closely anymore. His hair, once dark, had faded to iron gray, cut short out of habit rather than style. His eyes were hazel, sharp but tired, the kind that watched more than they spoke, shaped by decades of reading danger before it had a name. Ray lived alone in a small log cabin tucked against the tree line, a place chosen not for comfort but for distance. He had built his life smaller on purpose, less noise, less risk, less reason for anyone to expect anything from him. He had been a SWAT officer for nearly 30 years, long enough for adrenaline to carve deep grooves into his nervous system, long enough for violence to become a language he understood fluently. He retired after a winter operation years ago went wrong. An entry delayed by seconds, a structure compromised, a teammate named Aaron pinned beneath collapsing beams. Ray still remembered the heat, the smoke, the sound of Aaron's breathing slowing while Ray's hands worked uselessly against the debris. He remembered the radio crackling, the order to pull back, and the moment he realized saving one more life might cost many others. Aaron didn't make it out. Ray did. That night hollowed something essential inside him. The department called it survivor's guilt. Ray called it a debt he could never repay. When he left the force, he didn't make speeches or attend farewell dinners. He packed his gear, turned in his badge, and drove west until the roads thinned and the mountains rose high enough to block memories. Or so he hoped. The cabin was old, solid, and quiet. No neighbors, no cell service, just enough connection to the world to survive, not enough to belong to it. The only constant in Ray's life now sat beside him in the aging pickup truck, watching the storm with alert, intelligent eyes. Max was a German shepherd, 6 years old, black and tan with a broad chest and powerful legs built for endurance rather than speed. His fur was thick, especially around the neck, where it fluffed into a rough mane that trapped warmth against his skin. A thin white scar traced along his left shoulder, barely visible beneath the fur, the mark of an old training injury that never slowed him. Max's ears stood tall, rotating subtly with every shift of sound, his amber eyes bright and focused, even as the storm closed in. He was disciplined, calm, and deeply observant, traits honed during years of K-9 work alongside Ray. More than that, Max was steady. He did not panic. He did not hesitate without reason. That was why Ray trusted him more than most people he'd known. Ray guided the truck slowly along the narrow mountain road, tires crunching against packed snow. He had no destination, not really. Nights like this, when the storm pressed in and the silence grew heavy, it felt easier to keep driving than to sit alone with thoughts that refused to stay buried. He told himself he was just checking the road, just making sure no fallen trees blocked the pass, a habit left over from years of responsibility. The truth was less noble. Movement kept the memories quieter. The storm thickened without warning. Visibility dropped to a few car lengths. Ray's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knee throbbing in protest as he eased off the gas. Max shifted, muscles tensing, his nose lifting slightly as if catching something beneath the smell of snow and pine. Ray noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. Max didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply stared ahead, body rigid, ears angled forward. Ray's pulse quickened, the old instinct flickering awake despite his efforts to smother it. He slowed the truck to a crawl. For a moment, there was nothing but snow, wind, and the hypnotic sweep of headlights. Then Max stood. Without warning, without command, he rose from the passenger seat and planted himself squarely in front of the windshield, paws braced on the dashboard, blocking Ray's view. The truck rolled to a stop. Ray stared at him, irritation flaring before concern took its place. "Move," Ray said quietly, not harsh, just firm. Max didn't obey. His tail was stiff, his posture protective, his gaze locked on something beyond the glass. Ray felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation he'd spent years trying to forget. This was not disobedience. This was refusal. Max rarely broke command, and when he did, it was never without cause. Ray killed the engine. Silence rushed in, thick and absolute. The storm battered the truck, wind rocking the frame. Ray studied Max's profile, the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. This was the same posture Max had taken during searches, during moments when something was wrong but not yet visible. Ray exhaled slowly. He knew what came next, even as every part of him resisted it. He opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The cold struck immediately, slicing through layers of clothing and biting into his joints. Snow stung his face, melted into his beard, soaked the cuffs of his jacket. Ray scanned the road ahead, heart pounding not from fear but from recognition. He had promised himself something after Aaron died. Standing over that wreckage, feeling the weight of command and consequence crush down on him, Ray had sworn he was done. No more running toward danger, no more choices that ended with names carved into stone. He had carried that promise with him like armor, used it to justify the distance he kept from people, from responsibility, from hope. He told himself it was wisdom, experience, survival. But standing there in the storm, with Max watching him from the cab, Ray felt the lie crack. Because promises made in grief don't fade quietly. They wait. Ray took a step forward, then stopped. His knee screamed in protest, pain radiating up his leg, sharp and insistent. He could turn back now. He could get in the truck, drive home, tell himself there was nothing out there but snow and shadow. He had done his part. He had earned his rest. Max let out a low sound behind him, not a bark, not a whine, something closer to a warning. Ray closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the years pressing down. He knew this feeling. The moment before a door breached, the second when hesitation cost lives. When he opened his eyes, Ray didn't know yet what waited beyond the headlights. He only knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever was out there, Max had seen it, and Max would not move. Ray stood in the storm longer than he should have, the cold biting deeper with every passing second, the wind clawing at his jacket like it wanted him gone. Snow pressed against his boots, already trying to erase the fresh prints he had made, stepping away from the truck. Behind him, Max remained perfectly still inside the cab, watching, waiting. Ray forced himself to look forward again, scanning the edge of the road where darkness swallowed the reach of his headlights. At first, he saw nothing, just drifting snow and the jagged outline of trees bending under the weight of winter. Then, his eyes adjusted. There, something unnatural in the white, a shallow depression near the roadside, half filled with snow, too uneven to be a fallen branch. Ray moved closer, every step sending a sharp reminder through his left knee, the joint stiff and unreliable from an old injury that never healed right. He crouched with effort, breath fogging the air, and brushed snow aside with a gloved hand. The shape beneath was human. A woman lay partially curled near the low stone wall of an abandoned ranger outpost, her body angled awkwardly as if she had collapsed mid-step. Her name, Ray would later learn, was Linda Moore. She appeared to be in her mid-40s with a slender frame that looked smaller than it should have beneath layers of soaked winter clothing. Her build suggested someone who once hiked or walked often, but had lost strength over time. Her long chestnut brown hair spilled out from beneath a knit cap, tangled and stiff with ice, strands clinging to her pale cheeks. Her skin was light, almost ashen in the stormlight, drained of warmth, her lips tinged faintly blue. One leg lay twisted slightly outward, the boot at an unnatural angle that made Ray's stomach tighten. A clear sign of a bad sprain, possibly worse. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, each breath fogging weakly in the freezing air. Linda's face, even strained by pain and cold, carried a quiet softness. Fine lines traced the corners of her eyes, not from age alone but from years of worry and self-doubt. When her eyelids fluttered open briefly, her eyes, gray-blue and glassy, held confusion and fear, the look of someone who had been fighting to stay conscious far longer than her body could manage. Ray straightened slowly, the wind tearing at his face, his heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. This was exactly what he had sworn to walk away from, a stranger in need, a decision with consequences. He glanced back toward the truck. Max sat upright now, ears forward, watching every movement with focused intensity. Ray turned away again, anger rising, not at the woman, not at the dog, but at himself. "Damn it," he muttered, the word lost to the wind. He checked Linda's pulse with careful fingers, weak but present. She stirred slightly at his touch, a soft sound escaping her throat, more breath than voice. "Help," she whispered, barely audible. The words struck harder than the storm. Ray pulled his hand back as if burned. He could help. He knew how. But helping meant staying. It meant commitment. It meant reopening doors he had nailed shut years ago. He stood there, torn, the ache in his knee flaring sharply as he shifted his weight. The pain was real, insistent, reminding him of limits he could no longer ignore. At his age, one wrong move in this storm could put him down beside her, turning one rescue into two bodies lost in the snow. Ray took a step backward, just one, toward the truck, toward safety, toward the life he had built around distance and silence. The wind howled as if urging him on. Then he noticed something that stopped him cold. Max was no longer in the truck. Ray turned sharply. The passenger door stood open, snow swirling inside the cab. Max had stepped out and now stood several feet away, planted firmly in the road between Ray and the truck. His posture was rigid, his stance wide and grounded, muscles coiled beneath his thick fur. He was not approaching Linda. He was not retreating. He was blocking the path. Ray stared at him, disbelief mixing with a surge of something dangerously close to awe. "Max," Ray called, raising his voice over the wind. "Heel." The command was sharp, automatic, one used hundreds of times in training. Max did not move. His amber eyes met Ray's, steady and unflinching. This wasn't fear. This wasn't confusion. This was intent. Ray felt the years fall away in that moment, the memory of other nights, other decisions. Max had done this before, stood his ground when something was wrong, when instinct outweighed command. Ray's breath hitched. He took another step toward the truck. Max responded instantly, stepping forward to close the distance, still silent, still blocking the way. Snow gathered along his back, melting slowly into his fur, but he didn't flinch. Ray's chest tightened painfully. "You don't know what you're asking," Ray said, voice low, almost pleading. The dog tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood more than Ray wanted to admit. Ray looked back at Linda. She had shifted again, her hand twitching weakly against the snow, fingers bare and stiff, the glove missing or lost somewhere along the road. She was slipping. Ray could see it. Hypothermia was already taking hold. Time was not on her side. Ray closed his eyes, memories crashing in without mercy. Aaron's face, the heat, the radio call, the promise. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. When he opened his eyes, the storm felt quieter somehow, as if the world were holding its breath. Ray turned fully toward Max, kneeling with difficulty despite the protest from his knee. He placed a gloved hand against the dog's broad chest, feeling the steady strength beneath. If I do this, Ray said, voice rough, there's no turning back. Max didn't move. He didn't need to. Ray stood again, slower this time, pain flaring and then settling into a dull, manageable throb. He turned away from the truck completely and faced Linda once more. The decision settled into him with an unexpected calm, heavy but certain. He shrugged off his pack, already calculating what little he had to work with. He knelt beside Linda again, brushing snow from her face with careful hands. You're not alone, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Linda's eyes fluttered open a fraction, her gaze unfocused but searching. She didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. Ray glanced back once more. The truck waited behind Max, engine cold, path open if he chose to take it. Ray didn't. He exhaled slowly, squared his shoulders, and turned his full attention to the woman in the snow. The road behind him vanished under drifting white, but for the first time in years, Ray didn't look back. Ray worked quickly, not because panic drove him, but because discipline still lived somewhere deep in his bones. He forced his breathing to slow, counting each inhale against the roar of the storm, pushing the memories aside long enough to focus on what mattered now. Linda was alive. Barely. That was enough. He shrugged out of his pack and unrolled the emergency tarp he carried more out of habit than expectation, its edges stiff with cold. With practiced efficiency, he slid the tarp beneath her, careful of her twisted ankle, his jaw tightening when she gasped softly, her body tensing in reflexive pain. Easy, he murmured, voice low and steady, the same tone he once used with wounded officers and civilians alike. Linda's eyes fluttered, unfocused, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak but lacked the strength to form words. Ray wrapped her hands in spare socks, then layered his own scarf around her neck, ignoring the bite of cold against his skin. Hypothermia didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in, stole warmth inch by inch, dulled fear into dangerous calm. He had seen it before. Too many times. Max circled them once, then settled at Linda's side without being told, his body pressed close, thick fur blocking the wind. Ray spared him a brief glance of gratitude before threading a length of rope through the tarp's grommets. His knee protested sharply as he leaned back to test the weight, pain flaring hot and immediate. He gritted his teeth, adjusted his stance, and pulled again. The tarp slid, slow but steady, carving a shallow track through the snow. Each step toward the truck felt heavier than the last. The wind howled louder now, driving snow sideways, erasing the path behind them almost as soon as Ray made it. Linda stirred, a faint whimper escaping her throat. Ray paused, crouching beside her, forcing himself to ignore the tremor in his leg. "You're okay," he said, though he wasn't sure she heard him. "Just stay with me." Her eyelids lifted a fraction. Her gaze met his briefly, gray-blue eyes clouded but aware enough to register his presence. There was fear there, yes, but also something else. Relief, fragile and fleeting. Ray swallowed hard and stood again. The truck loomed through the storm like a dark shape half lost to the night. It took longer than it should have to reach it. By the time Ray maneuvered Linda into the back seat, his breath came in harsh bursts, each exhale fogging thickly in the cold air trapped inside the cab. He cranked the engine, relief washing through him when it turned over without complaint. Heat would take time, time they didn't have much of. Max jumped into the back without prompting, curling tightly against Linda, his head resting near her chest, ears alert. Ray pulled off his jacket and draped it over her, then shut the door firmly, sealing what little warmth they had inside. He climbed behind the wheel, hands shaking as much from exertion as from the cold. For a brief, dangerous moment, he considered turning around, heading straight down the mountain toward town. The road behind them was already disappearing under fresh snow. Visibility was worse than before. One wrong turn, one patch of ice, and they would be stranded anyway. Ray made the call he had been avoiding. He turned the wheel toward the tree line instead. The cabin was closer. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. The drive was slow, every curve a calculated risk. Ray leaned forward instinctively, as if proximity to the windshield might grant him more control. His knee throbbed relentlessly, each press of the pedal sending pain shooting up his leg. He welcomed it. Pain meant he was present. Pain meant he hadn't drifted back into the numb distance he'd lived in for years. When the cabin finally emerged through the snow, its dark outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees, Ray felt something loosen in his chest. He parked close, killed the engine, and moved quickly despite his fatigue. Inside, the cabin was exactly as he'd left it, cold, spare, functional. The air smelled faintly of wood and old smoke. Ray carried Linda inside with careful effort, her weight lighter than he expected, too light. He laid her gently on the couch near the stone fireplace, then moved on instinct, stacking kindling, striking a match with hands that still knew what to do even as his mind raced. The fire caught slowly, flames licking upward, casting weak orange light across the room. Ray knelt beside Linda, checking her pulse again, then her ankle, swelling already visible beneath her boot. He resisted the urge to fix what he couldn't yet fix. First warmth, first breathing. Max lay pressed against her legs now, a steady, living barrier against the cold. Linda's breathing eased slightly as the room warmed, but her skin remained pale, her body trembling despite the blankets Ray piled on. He poured water into a pot and set it near the fire, planning to warm it slowly. Shock didn't forgive impatience. Ray sat back on his heels, exhaustion settling into his bones. He studied Linda more closely now, the lines of strain on her face, the way her brow tightened even in semi-consciousness. She looked like someone who had been carrying too much alone for too long. He recognized that kind of weariness. Outside, the storm raged on, wind battering the walls, snow piling against the windows. Ray checked the radio out of habit, twisting the dial, listening to static hiss and fade. Nothing. He set it aside without comment. He had expected as much. He returned his attention to the fire, feeding it carefully, unwilling to let it die. The flames reflected in his eyes, and for a moment the years peeled back. He remembered other nights, other fires, waiting for daylight that never seemed to come soon enough. He remembered promises made and broken. Max shifted, lifting his head to look at Ray, amber eyes steady. Ray met his gaze and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the line they had crossed together. The fire crackled softly, stubbornly alive. Ray stayed where he was, watching over Linda, feeding the flames, refusing to let the warmth fade. Outside, winter showed no mercy. Inside, Ray Coleman did not allow the fire to go out. The fire had settled into a steady burn by the time Ray made the decision he'd been circling for over an hour. Linda's breathing was slower now, more even, but her skin remained cold to the touch despite the blankets, her body trembling in shallow waves that spoke of shock fighting exhaustion. Ray had seen this pattern before. Temporary warmth could not outrun infection or untreated trauma. He needed supplies. More than that, he needed a way to reach someone beyond the trees and the storm. The cabin radio sat uselessly silent on the shelf, its soft hiss mocking him every time he passed. Ray stood near the window, staring out at the white blur beyond the glass, jaw clenched. He knew the mountain. He knew what waited outside. And he knew there was one place that might still offer what he needed. The old rescue cabin sat higher up the ridge, a structure he'd helped reinforce years ago during joint winter training exercises when he was still active. It wasn't marked on most maps anymore, forgotten and half buried by time. But if anything remained there, medical supplies, a radio, it would be his only chance. Ray looked down at Linda. Her brow was damp with sweat now, a dangerous sign in the cold, lashes fluttering as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Max lay pressed against her side, unmoving, eyes open, alert. Ray knelt, resting a hand briefly on the dog's broad neck. "Watch her," he said quietly. Max's ears flicked once in acknowledgement. Ray layered on his coat, tightened his boots, and strapped a small pack across his shoulders. His movements were deliberate, economical. No wasted motion. He paused at the door, one hand resting against the frame longer than necessary. Leaving her alone went against every instinct he had left, but staying would cost them both. The storm hit him like a wall the moment he stepped outside. Wind tore at his coat, snow stinging his eyes, visibility collapsing to a few feet. Ray leaned into it, muscles burning as he forced his legs to move. His knee protested immediately, a sharp, grinding pain that radiated upward, but he adjusted his gait, shifting weight, working around the weakness the way he always had. The climb was brutal. Drifts rose to his thighs in places, forcing him to lift each step high, breath tearing from his lungs. He counted his movements, focused on rhythm instead of distance. Memory guided him where sight could not. A bent pine leaning against the slope, a boulder shaped like a crouched animal, landmarks buried beneath snow but etched into his mind from years past. When the rescue cabin finally emerged from the storm, it looked smaller than he remembered, its slanted roof nearly swallowed by snow, the door half hidden behind a drift. Ray shoved against it with his shoulder until it gave, spilling him into darkness thick with the scent of old wood and dust. He fumbled for his flashlight, beam cutting through the gloom. The cabin was frozen in time. Rusted climbing tools hung along the walls. Coils of rope stiff with age lay stacked in the corner. Ray moved quickly, checking shelves, opening drawers with numbed fingers. The first aid kit sat where he hoped it would, dented but intact. He tore it open, relief flooding through him at the sight of bandages, antiseptic, splints, old but usable. He shoved what he could into his pack. Then he saw it. The radio. A heavy weathered unit bolted to the wall, antenna bent but intact. Ray's heart hammered as he powered it on. Static roared loud and aggressive. He adjusted the dial, hands shaking now despite his effort to stay calm. "Come on," he muttered. The static softened, shifted, then cracked. A faint voice bled through, broken and distant. Ray leaned in, speaking fast, clear, the old command voice slipping free. "This is Ray Coleman. Emergency, North Ridge, injured woman, severe hypothermia and trauma, requesting immediate assistance." He repeated it twice, adjusting frequency between attempts. The signal wavered, cut, then returned briefly. "Copy. Storm interference, hold position, rescue grounded, will attempt at first break." The transmission dissolved back into noise. Ray sagged against the wall, breath shuddering. One message. That was all he was going to get. He powered the radio down, conserving what little life remained in it, and closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. That was when he noticed the plaque. A small wooden board nailed above the workbench, letters faded but still legible. "If you find this place, you are not lost. You are exactly where you needed to be." Ray swallowed hard. His father's handwriting. Robert Coleman had been a volunteer rescuer long before Ray ever wore a badge, a man who went into storms not because he was fearless, but because he couldn't stand the thought of someone waiting alone in the dark. Ray had spent years running from that legacy, convincing himself he was different. Standing there now, he wasn't so sure. He shouldered his pack and stepped back into the storm. The descent was worse. Snow shifted underfoot, wind screaming through the trees. Halfway down the ridge, disaster struck. A crack split the air above him, sharp and violent. Ray barely had time to look up before a heavy, ice-laden branch broke free and crashed down. He twisted instinctively, the branch grazing his shoulder and knocking him off balance. He hit the slope hard, sliding several feet before slamming into a drift that stopped his fall. Pain exploded through his shoulder and down his arm, hot and blinding. Ray lay there for a second, gasping, snow filling his collar. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard it. Max's bark. Faint, distant, urgent. The sound cut through the pain like a lifeline. Ray rolled onto his side, forcing his arm to move. It responded with agony, but it moved. He pushed himself upright inch by inch, teeth clenched, breath ragged. "I'm coming," he rasped, not sure if the words carried anywhere at all. The rest of the descent passed in a blur of pain and stubbornness. By the time the cabin came into view again, Ray's arm was soaked, blood dark against the snow. Max met him at the door, fur bristling, eyes wide. Ray didn't stop. He stumbled inside, slamming the door shut against the storm. Linda lay where he'd left her, but something was wrong. Her skin had gone ghostly pale, her breathing shallow and rapid, lips edged with blue. Shock had tightened its grip while he was gone. Ray dropped to his knees beside her, pack spilling open as he tore it apart, hands working on instinct even as his injured shoulder screamed. "Stay with me," he said, voice hoarse. Max pressed close, whining softly, tail still. Ray worked through the supplies, splinting, warming, stabilizing, forcing calm into every motion. Outside, the storm battered the cabin without mercy. Inside, Ray fought to keep Linda alive, knowing the call he'd made might be the only one he would get. Night loosened its grip slowly, as if reluctant to give up what it had claimed. The storm still raged outside the cabin, but its fury had dulled, the wind no longer screaming with the same murderous intensity. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, its embers glowing like a stubborn promise that refused to die. Ray knelt beside Linda, his injured shoulder throbbing in time with his pulse, every movement measured now, careful. He had done all he could with what he had. Bandages secured, splint tightened, blankets layered, warmth maintained. Now came the hardest part, waiting. Linda's breathing faltered again near midnight, one shallow inhale, then another too quick, her chest tightening as if the air itself had turned against her. Ray felt the old fear surge, sharp and merciless. He checked her pulse, thin, erratic. Shock was pulling her under. "Stay with me," he said firmly, leaning closer, his voice cutting through the quiet like a lifeline. He remembered other nights like this, other faces going pale beneath flickering lights, other hands he'd held while the world burned around them. He refused to let this one end the same way. When Linda's eyes rolled back and her body went slack, Ray didn't hesitate. Training took over, burying doubt beneath action. He lowered her carefully to the floor, laying her flat, fingers interlacing at the center of her chest. He began compressions, counting under his breath, jaw clenched, arms burning as he pushed rhythm back into a heart that wanted to forget its duty. Max circled them anxiously, whining softly, nails clicking against the floorboards. Ray paused only long enough to give breaths, then resumed, sweat beating at his temples despite the cold. "Come on," he muttered, "not tonight." Time stretched, elastic and cruel. Then, suddenly, Linda gasped. A sharp, shuddering inhale tore from her chest, her body jerking beneath Ray's hands. He froze, breath caught in his throat, then exhaled slowly as her breathing resumed, uneven but unmistakably alive. Relief hit him so hard his vision blurred. Max pressed forward immediately, nudging Linda's cheek gently with his nose, tail sweeping the floor once before he settled back beside her, protective and calm once more. Ray sank back on his heels, chest heaving, one hand braced against the floor to steady himself. "You're still here," he whispered, brushing ice-matted hair from Linda's forehead. Outside, the storm howled, but inside the cabin, something fragile and precious held its ground. Dawn crept in gray and tentative, light seeping through frost-laced windows. Ray hadn't slept. He couldn't. He checked Linda's breathing every few minutes, fed the fire, and fought off the creeping exhaustion that threatened to drag him down. When the sound finally came, it took him a moment to recognize it. The low thump-thump of rotors cutting through the air. Ray's head snapped up. The noise grew louder, steadier, unmistakable. A rescue helicopter emerged through the thinning snow, its searchlight slicing across the clearing outside the cabin. Ray pushed himself to his feet, pain flaring through his shoulder and knee, and stumbled outside, waving his arms despite the wind. The helicopter circled once, then settled nearby, snow whipping outward in a furious spiral. 2 rescuers jumped down, moving with practiced urgency. One was a tall man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a ranger's uniform beneath his winter gear. His sandy blonde beard was neatly trimmed, his blue eyes alert but calm. His name was Ethan Brooks, a senior park ranger known for his cautious, methodical approach to mountain rescues after losing a hiker years earlier due to a rushed decision. The other rescuer, a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair, pulled into a tight braid and weathered olive skin, introduced herself quickly as Maria Sanchez, a flight medic whose steady hands and direct gaze spoke of long experience under pressure. They moved past Ray without wasting words, assessing Linda with swift efficiency. "You did good," Maria said quietly as she checked Linda's vitals, her tone firm but respectful. "You kept her alive." The words hit Ray harder than any blow. He nodded once, unable to trust his voice. They stabilized Linda and prepared her for transport, loading her carefully onto a stretcher. Max followed closely until Ray rested a hand on his collar, murmuring reassurance. "It's okay," he told the dog. "They've got her now." Linda stirred as they lifted her, eyes opening briefly. She found Ray's face through the haze, recognition flickering weakly. "You came back," she whispered, her voice thin but certain. Ray swallowed, nodding. "I wasn't going to leave you." She closed her eyes again as they carried her out, but the faint curve of a smile lingered. The helicopter lifted off, vanishing into the morning sky, carrying Linda toward warmth, care, and a future she had almost lost. Silence settled over the clearing once more. Ray stood there for a long moment, Max at his side, watching until the sound faded completely. Weeks passed. Winter loosened its hold, snow retreating inch by inch as spring crept cautiously into the mountains. Ray's shoulder healed slowly, his knee never quite forgiving him, but life found a new rhythm. Linda returned one afternoon, walking carefully with a cane, her frame still slender but stronger now, her chestnut hair pulled back loosely, color returned to her cheeks. She looked different. Not untouched by what had happened, but shaped by it. "I needed to see the place," she said simply, standing at the edge of the clearing. "And to thank you." Ray nodded, unsure what to say. Words had never been his strength. They talked quietly, not about the storm or the night that nearly took her life, but about ordinary things, trails reopening, the slow work of healing, the strange relief of being alive after thinking you didn't deserve to be. Linda told him she was starting therapy, reconnecting with family she had pushed away, volunteering at a support center for adults who felt lost the way she had. Ray listened, Max resting at his feet, tail flicking lazily. As summer approached, Ray made changes to the cabin. He reinforced the roof, cleared the trail, installed a radio repeater with the help of the rangers. A simple wooden sign appeared near the road: Winter Refuge, Emergency Shelter. He didn't call it heroism, he called it preparedness, People began to know the place, not as a miracle, but as an option, a light in bad weather. On a quiet evening, Ray sat on the porch, the sun dipping low behind the trees, Max lying beside him, muzzle graying slightly now. Ray rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. He thought about the promise he'd made years ago, the one he believed had kept him alive. He understood now that it had never been meant to close doors, only to remind him of the cost of caring. Ray exhaled slowly, watching the last of the winter shadows fade. Some people never stop being rescuers. They just forget for a while that they still can be. Sometimes the hardest storms aren't the ones outside, but the ones we carry quietly every day. This story isn't just about a man, a dog, or a winter night on a mountain. It's about the moment when walking away feels safer than stepping back in and choosing to turn around anyway. In our own lives, we all pass people who are hurting, not always in the snow, but in silence, grief, loneliness, or exhaustion. You may never wear a uniform or face a blizzard, but you face choices just as real, to ignore or to help, to stay distant or to care. If this story reminded you that compassion still matters, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what moment in this story stayed with you the most, or if you've ever been the person who needed help and someone chose not to walk away. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Thank you so much for watching.